Hello folks. Jill and I have been back for a week after a glorious trip to Namaqualand to see the flowers, and the flowers are absolutely magnificent, breathtaking, and you get to the stage after a few days of looking at flowers and flowers and flowers, of being on a kind of high, flower high. And so over the past week, we've come down to earth, so to speak, although I find I'm noticing patches of flowers much more than I did before. In chapter 2 of the letter of James, the apostle considers it necessary to rebuke members of the church for showing favoritism towards those who are rich, whilst paying scant attention to poorer members of the church. The church in that particular situation was mirroring society, where the wealthy and influential call the shots, and people scurry around trying to please them. It's a perfectly understandable temptation. The people with means have the potential to be generous benefactors of the organization. Gaining their favor can solve all kinds of financial problems. The poor, on the other hand, are needy. The more we focus on the poor, the more we watch our resources diminish. James does not understand why those in the church would want to make a fuss of the very people who oppress and exploit the poor. And instead of challenging society's norms, exposing hypocrisy and superficiality and arrogant use of power by those who have wealth, the church then was upholding the same warped principles of the world, bowing and scraping before the powerful. The church's witness and integrity are called into question when it follows the ways of the world, terrified that those with financial clout might be offended and withdraw their financial support. Those with means often make their preferences known loudly and clearly. If the clergy and church leaders dare to do anything too controversial, there is a very real threat of withdrawal of significant financial support. I always remember how our personal supply of eggs and fresh milk dried up in Underberg many years ago when I said something that people considered quite radical. Whereas Jesus had a preference for the poor, the economically challenged, those on the fringes of society, the socially unacceptable, the church often can be rightly criticized for pandering to the needs or the whims of those who are at least middle class and comfortable. Position in society, status, pomp and ceremony, maintenance of sometimes beautifully impressive buildings and church plants, tradition and ritual, all of these things might command disproportionate attention and funds. If COVID-19 has forced the church into crisis in some ways, with dwindling resources, or perhaps exacerbated already existing problems and challenges in many parts of the church, then perhaps that's a good thing. Can the church reinvent itself so that it is more relevant to a changed world? Too often we have had a business as usual approach, and that is not going to be effective in terms of providing meaningful ministry that is received by people, so that people will want to return to churches and to be part of church communities. That, however, is not the main focus of this message. Can we throw off this inclination to show favoritism, to manifest preference for particular sectors of society or particular classes of people? In our own lives, can we throw off this inclination to show favoritism? It is so easy for us to favor people and favor groups of people that we can relate to and identify with easily. To choose to associate with like-minded people with whom we feel comfortable, and to distance ourselves from those who are unlike us, who belong to different social groupings, who have very different views. I cannot imagine how anyone would want to support Jacob Zuma. I cannot understand people who are anti-vaccination because of what I consider crazy conspiracy theories. They are people that I don't feel naturally drawn towards to have a conversation with. I cannot relate to most of the stuff that the EFF says or the Freedom Front. I feel stifled in the presence of people who are so steeped in tradition that their major concern is whether they or we are conforming properly, obeying the rules, doing things that the way they should be done. I'm skeptical of fundamentalists who have easy answers and are sometimes triumphalistic, even though what they believe doesn't seem to work in real life. And I wish they would be challenged to try to work out who God really is. And so there are groups of people that I instinctively would want to steer clear of. And I'd be quite happy, if left to my own devices, to avoid any kind of contact and to stay with people that I can understand and agree with mostly. But huge chasms between people and huge chasms in society risk growing larger if we all retreat into safe groups. Whilst I do not believe that we are called to be wishy-washy people pleasers, trying to be everything to everyone and able to converse about all kinds of things, even participating in inane conversations, I don't believe that, but I do believe that we are called to try to understand why people think and behave as they do, seeking to see from another vantage point other than my own. Obviously, there are radical extremists whose violent practices we could never condone. And there are people, certainly, that we could not have any fellowship with. But there ought to be some common ground with the majority of people so that we can meet in the middle. It is sad if we don't meet. We don't have to try to persuade other people to agree with us. And we don't have to allow other people to think that we're going to be persuaded by them. But most people, though we think very differently, are reasonable, tolerant, and peace-loving. Brian McLaren, a well-known Christian author who speaks out of the American context and who, amongst other authors, is concerned about the huge divide between the Democrats and the Republicans in America, and the fact that they are so often such fierce enemies. Brian McLaren speaks about the biases that all of us have. And some of those we are conscious of, and others we are not most of the time. And of course, it's really healthy to be able to recognize our personal bias towards or against something for various reasons. And if we're aware of our personal bias, then there is the possibility of changing, of recognizing that our thinking perhaps is a bit skewed, and that we need to really seriously consider the other point of view and to try to be more objective. And so Brian McLaren mentions 13 kinds of bias that affect us. And this is going to be a bit much to take in one go, but I'm going to mention the 13 that he talks about. And I'm sure that, as Jill and I did when we listened to a couple of podcasts, I'm sure that you will find this interesting. And some of these things that he has to say about kinds of bias you will recognize in yourself, and others might be illuminating. Firstly, confirmation bias. When we judge new ideas based on how easily they fit in with and confirm what we already believe and practice. So we're looking for things that will fit in with what we think. Confirmation bias. Secondly, complexity bias. We prefer simple truth. And if something gets a bit too complicated, we might shy away from it. Thirdly, community bias. We probably won't see what the community that we belong to won't see. 4, complementarity bias. If you reject my ideas, then I'll reject your ideas. On the other hand, if you respect my ideas, then I'll respect yours. 5, competency bias. We think we know as much as other people know. 6, consciousness bias. Where I am presently prevents my seeing certain things now. But if I keep on growing, then this might change. Number 7, comfort or complacency bias. I want to stay comfortable and unchallenged. Number 8, conservative or liberal bias. I'm inclined towards fairness and kindness, or otherwise I'm inclined towards purity, loyalty, liberty and authority in terms of my political thinking and allegiances. Number 9, confidence bias. The person who speaks with confidence is more likely to impress me and win my support. Number 10, catastrophe or normalcy bias. I notice what is dramatic and obvious, but not the more subtle changes. 11. Contact bias. Lack of contact with others who have different values, beliefs, and practices means my prejudices and my assumptions are reinforced. Number 12, cash bias. When there's money for me in some course of action, perhaps, then it's hard to see with proper objectivity. And finally, conspiracy bias. When we are feeling stressed or feeling guilty about something, our conscience is troubling us, then we will look for whatever excuses our attitude or behavior, whatever will vindicate us, making us feel better about ourselves and about our actions. Our biases affect what we can and cannot see, and they keep us in prison, a kind of prison really, so that other people who think and behave very differently seem to be our enemies, and it's a case of us and them. And this is responsible for making us feel totally alienated from other groups of people, so that we can't relate to them at all. In fact, we have no desire to try to meet them midway or try to understand where they are coming from and why they're thinking what they're thinking, and so on. And the question is, as Brian McLaren would ask, or as Richard Rohr said when he quoted these 13 biases that Brian McLaren came up with, the question that Richard Rohr asks is, will we be willing to recognize our own biases and let go of them so that we are free to see Christ in others, free to understand others, free to engage with others? Quite apart from how my bias negatively impacts my attitude and my behavior towards other people, it's of course so important that I am able to see how I am biased personally. And it's important that we should all acknowledge that our context, our upbringing, our education, whatever we've been exposed to has caused us to be biased in particular ways. And so, of course, what God would want and what we should want, because we care about growing, is that we should be on a course of understanding ourselves more and seeing how we are biased and how we favor certain things and certain people, and our prejudices, our attitudes towards other things, that we should see those things in ourselves, and that we should work to become free, so that we don't have such hardened attitudes, fixed attitudes, where we are ready to reject people and reject groups and have no truck with what they think and what they say and so on. So I pray that you and I will be challenged to spend some time thinking about the ways in which we are biased in one way or another, and how that affects our behavior. And I pray again that we'll become more free. Amen, and may God bless you.